4 banks and credit unions approved me for $54,500, and what happened afterward completely changed how I look at underwriting. So after testing 6 different lenders, I'm starting to believe a lot of credit unions have a serious false limit problem. So in a second, you'll see which lenders pulled Equifax and which ones pulled TransUnion, and you'll see how a couple of credit unions appeared to approve me at first, only to come back asking for what felt like mortgage level documentation. Plus, I'll show you which credit union increased my limit from $500 all the way up to $10,000 before my card arrived in the mailbox. By the way, I always recommend checking for pre-approvals first before you apply for credit cards. It'll save you a ton of hard credit pulls, trust me. Now, I created a credit card pre-approval master list, so just hit that link below to get access for free. Now, before I show you the results, here's what my profile was looking like before I applied. I had an Equifax FICO score of 782, my credit utilization was 3%, my oldest account was 17 years and 3 months, my average age of accounts was 5 years and 8 months, and for recent inquiries, I had about 5 in the last 6 months, and that was with TransUnion. So in other words, this wasn't a rebuilding profile. This was a pretty strong credit profile, if I might say so myself. And even then, 2 credit unions still pushed me into extensive manual underwriting. That was one of the biggest surprises from this entire experiment. So here's a breakdown of all my approvals. First, it was Truist with a $14,500 limit, and that was on the business side. Then I got in with Langley Federal Credit Union for $5,000. Credit Union 1 initially for $500, but that got boosted up to $10,000. And then there was Navy Federal for $25,000. Now the total was $54,500. And the banks and credit unions that pulled Equifax were Truist, Langley, and Union 1 and Pelican Credit Union. And then the ones that pulled TransUnion were Navy Federal and BECU. Now let's get into what actually happened, because the approval amounts only tell a part of the story. So Truist was probably the most straightforward lesson I learned. I opened the business account back in December and then immediately applied with roughly $100 sitting in the account. I was denied. No real explanation. Instead of forcing it, I left the account alone. And a few months later, I deposited around $8,000 from a business payment and let the money sit for roughly 2 weeks. Then I applied again. This time I was approved for $14,000 on the Truist Business Cash Rewards card. So same business, same owner, right? Same credit profile, different relationship. That's why I still believe that deposits matter with certain banks, especially when you're applying for business products. But moving on. I would say the surprise winner is Langley, and it actually was one of the most pleasant experiences I had. I only deposited around $100 into the checking account and then another $100 into the savings. That was it. Then a concierge representative actually reached out to introduce themselves and offered to answer any questions I had. And I gotta say, that level of service immediately stood out to me. I applied for the Langley Signature Cashback Card, and I was approved for $5,000. So no drama, no doc requests, no weird underwriting surprises, just a normal approval. And honestly, if every credit union worked like Langley, then this video will be a lot shorter. Now, the next one was Credit Union 1, and this had to be the weirdest approval. You know, this one still makes me laugh to this day. And I don't even have a bank account with Credit Union 1. Never opened one. But their card is backed by Elon Financial, and they offer a pre-approval tool. I checked the pre-approval first, then I applied, and I got approved for $500. Now, that wasn't exciting, I understand. But a few days later, before the card even arrived, I got an email saying that my limit had been increased to $10,000. Now, that tells me the first number isn't always the final number. And that's a lesson that became even more important later on in the story. You're going to see. And then there was Navy Federal, and this one delivered the biggest approval by far. You know, I had around $1,000 in deposits, and then one direct deposit hit the account before applying. So nothing crazy, you know, it wasn't too complicated. They pulled TransUnion and approved me for $25,000 on the More Rewards card. And there was no document chase, no tax returns, no underwriting, scavenger hunt, just a normal approval process. And compared to what happened later, that simplicity was very attractive. Now, I gotta say, I think that credit unions have a false limit problem. And this is probably the biggest lesson that I learned from this entire experiment that I did. And this is a problem that I had with Pelican and BECU. And at first glance, both look like wins. You know, Pelican showed me a $5,000 approval amount. BECU showed me a $10,000 approval amount. You know, most people would see those numbers and assume the deal is done. But that couldn't be farther from the truth. Now, when it comes to Pelican, before applying, I deposited $1,000 into my account and let the relationship sit for about a week. A few days after the approval message, underwriting contacted me. They noticed a few inquiries and they wanted explanations about them. Then they determined I was self-employed, and for the first time I can remember on a credit card application, that became a major issue. Next thing I know, they're asking for 2 years of tax returns, 12 months of business bank statements for a credit card. Not a mortgage, not a business loan, a credit card. And remember, I already had money on deposit with them. So at that point, I was out. And then there was BECU, and that was even worse. So before applying, I deposited $700 into the account and waited a month before submitting the application. They also became the only credit union I've ever joined that required me to call in just to set up external transfers. Honestly, it just boggles my mind that external transfers aren't enabled by default in 2026. And then the underwriting request started. They wanted 2 recent pay stubs, 2 years of W-2s, investment statements, proof of address, copies of my social security card, again, for a credit card. So not a business loan, not a mortgage, just a simple credit card. At that point, I withdrew my money and I moved on from there. And here's why I call these false limits. And some people, you might disagree with me here, and that's fine. But personally, I don't trust the initial limit that many credit unions show during the application process. Not until underwriting is complete, not until documentation is complete, and definitely not until its card is actually on the way to my house. Because what good is a $10,000 approval amount if underwriting can still come back and ask for a mountain of paperwork? What good is a $5,000 approval amount if a real decision hasn't been made yet? So to me, those numbers aren't real yet. They're provisional or preliminary. They're what I call a false limit. And I've seen enough data points online to know that this isn't unique to me. Some people see the amount stay the same. Some people see an increase. Some see a decrease. If that's the worst case. And some get approved and others get denied. The point is this: the first number isn't always the final answer. Now, I was already aware of this issue, but these applications made it painfully clear just how common it has become. Many credit unions use modern software on the front end, and the applications feel fast. The interface feel modern. The approval message arrives quickly. You might even see a credit limit on the screen and think you're done. But then the application disappears into a manual underwriting department, and that's where the real process begins. You may get calls, you might get texts, you might get emails. You may have to explain inquiries. You may have to verify income or send in documents. And you may have to wait for someone in underwriting to manually review your file. And if you miss that message, your application can just sit there for days, sometimes even weeks. And what surprised me most wasn't that the underwriting existed. It was how often the initial approval seemed more like a placeholder than a final decision. So the real approval process didn't even begin, when I submitted the application. It began after the application left the automated system and landed on someone's desk. So if you're applying with credit unions, understand this: the application isn't over just because you see a number on the screen. In many cases, it's only the beginning. But listen, there are so many more credit unions across the country that will let anyone who lives in the US become a member. And one of them is GBank, and they're based in Nevada. And you know what? I just got pre-qualified for the GBank visa again, and this time it showed I could start with up to a $10,000 limit.